Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation on the Degree Qualifications Profile and Accreditation, or another way to think of it is, can the Degree Qualifications Profile, or DQP, be used to help with regional and program accreditation efforts, reports, etc.? My name is Nakia Pope. I'm currently at the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio, where I'm Director of Academic Assessment. This is part of my Leap Texas Fellow project. So I'm a Leap Texas Fellow for 2017, and I can be reached at popein@utesca.edu. I'm on Twitter at @profpope, and this, as well as all other Leap Texas Fellows projects and archives, are up on our website at leaptx.org. So my plan for today is to go through this pretty short slideshow that kind of has the following four parts. First, I'll do a brief overview of the DQP. I'm kind of assuming if you've gotten this far to the presentation, you at least know something about the DQP, but I wanted to go over it and hit a couple highlights. Then second, I'll talk about the DQP and the SACS COC standards. Here at UT Health San Antonio, we've just submitted our compliance report. So all these are very fresh in my mind, which is kind of what prompted me to do this presentation to begin with. Then third, I'll take a look at the DQP as it relates to the Commission on Collegiate Nursing Education Standards for Accreditation. I just picked the CCNA Standards because they're easily accessible and I know about them because of my position here at the Health Science Center, but I also thought that some professional accreditation body standards would be good to look at in relationship to the DQP, and B, I picked nursing because that was probably the most common one and can be found at various institutions of higher education across Texas at various levels, so community colleges, bachelor's institutions, or advanced professional or research-oriented institutions like the UT Health Science Center. And then finally, I'll do some final thoughts about how the DQP may or may not be useful in these kinds of accreditation efforts and reporting. First, we'll start with a little bit of basics about the Degree Qualifications Profile. The DQP is a Lumina Foundation attempt to define learning outcomes that define academic credentials, such as the associate's, bachelor's, and master's degree. I say such as, but really it only seeks to define learning outcomes that define those three particular degree levels. And it's not just the Lumina Foundation. The Lumina Foundation has worked in concert with a host of higher education institutions to refine, test, and generally outline what the DQP is. And so various institutions have implemented the DQP to varying degrees. Another way to think about the DQP is it tries to answer the question, what does an associate's, bachelor's, or master's degree mean, apart from the idea that a student has completed X number of hours of seat time? From a student perspective, which I hope to explore in another phase of my Leap Texas project, it's a way for students to say, I have an associate's degree. That means I have done or can do X, Y, and Z. I have achieved all these distinct learning outcomes in research or in collaborative learning, and so it's a way to kind of better map out what a college credential means in terms of learning outcomes or skills. An easy way to understand the DQP is to look at it as a grid. And if you click on the DQP Grid link there, it will take you to the Lumina Foundation website where there's an interactive version of the DQP Grid. So on one axis of the grid are these 5 learning categories which kind of contain the learning outcomes. And then on the other axis of the grid are the 3 degrees, or associate's, bachelor's, and master's degree level. So lay it all out. You have a pretty comprehensive grid that defines learning outcomes for each degree within each of these 5 learning categories. So the 5 learning categories, as you can see on the slide, are specialized knowledge, broad and integrative knowledge, intellectual skills, applied and collaborative learning, and civic and global learning. I won't work through each category in detail because A, that would take me a long time, and B, I should probably get on to talking about the accreditation stuff, but a couple of quick notes. First, number 3, intellectual skills, is further broken down into 6 particular skills that are traditional and non-traditional cognitive skills: analytic inquiry, use of information resources, engaging diverse perspectives, ethical reasoning, quantitative fluency, and communicative fluency. So for each one of those skills, like every one of those categories, you have one or more particular outcomes for each degree. So the grid itself is large and pretty complex, which is why that interactive DQP grid on the Lumina website is so helpful. A second thing to note is that all 5 of them, all 5 of the categories at some level can be seen as sort of general education outcomes, but a quick look at the grid and at the objectives themselves shows these outcomes can certainly be met or tweaked very easily to be met into or within a particular major or specialized academic field. Some, as you might imagine, are deliberately integrative, such as broad and integrative knowledge, which asks students to bring together knowledge and skills gained from a variety of academic fields to meet those particular learning outcomes. But the particular outcomes can be met within, within a major, within a particular specialized field of study. So, for example, one of the bachelor's level applied and collaborative learning outcomes is negotiates a strategy for group research or performance, documents the strategy, implements the strategy, and communicates the results. Well, that can be done in a lab as part of a lab team. It can be done in a group project within a literature course. It can be done within a performance ensemble within a music course, or a team-based setting within, a clinical nursing course. Finally, the specialized knowledge category is an attempt to address what students in any specialization should demonstrate with respect to that specialization, but in terms of specific disciplinary knowledge, that is where the tuning process comes in. So the tuning process is where disciplinary experts sort of get together and work through what learning objectives are appropriate for the discipline. And the tuning process is often paired with the DQP for this exact reason. I'm not going to talk too much about the tuning process within today's presentation, but there are other LINC faculty fellows who have explored tuning in a much greater detail, so I would urge you to look at those things because they're pretty fantastic. All right, so given the DQP, I wonder, can or how the DQP can be helpful in meeting various accreditation standards. Again, having just turned in a SACS compliance report a couple of weeks ago, all of this is very much on my mind, and I wondered, well, if my institution, had used the DQP, or if other institutions had used the DQP or had the DQP embedded within their curriculum and assessment structure, would meeting these standards and complying with these standards and writing about these standards have been any easier. And so I picked SACS COC. That's obviously, every institution in Texas has to respond to those standards. And I also picked CCNA just as an example of a professional accreditation body, a series of professional accreditation standards, which would be interesting to see if the DQP can be helpful there. So, as those of you who have been involved in SACS reaccreditation undoubtedly know, many of the SACS standards are not about academics at all, and so obviously the degree qualifications profile won't be a lot of help there. But there are a lot about academics, of course, and kind of out of the ones that are focused on academics, I think these six here could be helped along the most by the degree qualifications profile. So I'll talk about them each very briefly, but before I do, I wanted to say that the DQP isn't going to write your SACS reaffirmation report for you, but I think having the DQP in place makes the writing of these academic narratives, these assessment narratives, much easier. I should also add that I'm kind of assuming that you know something about what these standards are if you've made it this far into a presentation about the degree qualifications profile and accreditation. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot specifically about what the standards are and how to approach them. Well, with that warning out of the way, let me talk about 3311 and 351. 3311 is Educational Programs Assessment, or the big academic assessment narrative. And then 351 is the standard that has to do with general education and general education competencies. So for these two standards, or really any standard that deals with learning outcomes and how they're identified and how they're assessed, I think the DQP can be a tremendous asset in setting up a framework or an assessment framework that will allow kind of ease of information gathering and reporting on those academic assessment standards, because the DQP gives you a big list of learning outcomes, easily customizable for specific programs or specific disciplines, and not only that, it gives you kind of artifacts, or what can be turned into assignments that would produce student artifacts for assessment. So all of those things that the DQP says students will be able to do, you can ask students to do, and you already have them kind of keyed towards specific learning outcomes for various degree levels in the 5 categories of the DQP. Additionally, one of the things you have to do in 3311 and 351 is at least have some justification of the learning outcomes that you did choose, particularly in 351 for the general education competencies. And the DQP kind of gives you a ready-made answer for that part of those standards. It's a nationally normed, widely used, developed through a rigorous process kind of set of learning outcomes and artifacts. So making that argument, that this is why we picked these competencies, or this is why we picked these particular outcomes, is pretty easy if you're using the DQP. I think the DQP is especially useful for 351 for the general education competencies, because fundamentally that's what they are, or that's what the DQP is. It while it can be put into various subject matters and disciplines, the idea of the 5 broad categories of the DQP are sort of general education outcomes that stand for a particular type of degree, bachelor's, associates, what have you, while not being specific to any particular discipline. Furthermore, depending on how you framed it, the 5 categories of the DQP themselves might be useful for general education competencies themselves, with the specific outcomes underneath being able to be used into sort of a rotating schedule of assignments and rubrics. So I think the degree qualifications profile is particularly useful for SACS Standard 351, general education competencies. In a similar vein, I think the degree qualifications profile could be helpful for the program requirement, SACS Standards 353 and 364. You have to justify why those program requirements are there, and so certainly the DQP, being a research-backed national nationally used set of outcomes can help you justify the use of those outcomes in your particular program. And the DQP supplies pretty clear requirements for undergraduate and graduate level programs with its master's degree level. And so you say, our students in all programs are required to show these competencies and these competencies are good because they're in the DQP and they're tied to X, Y, and Z. And I think you'd be pretty good to go for 353 and 364. Finally, I think the degree qualification profile could be a lot of help for 361 and 362. And these are the post-baccalaureate rigor where you sort of have to show that your master's degree programs or doctoral degree programs, but the DQP won't really be helpful there. But it's where you have to show that your graduate programs are more rigorous than comparable or the same undergraduate programs, and that those graduate programs are different and distinct in curriculum from the undergraduate programs. And I think the DQP could be exceptionally helpful for this because it already aligns but differentiates bachelor's degree program or bachelor's degree learning outcomes from master's degree learning outcomes. So all one has to do, is say we use these learning outcomes for our bachelor's degree programs and this other set of learning outcomes for our master's degree programs. They're aligned in the same categories, right? But they're clearly distinct, and the master's degree programs have a higher standard or more rigorous learning outcomes. Also, the 362, the graduate curriculum, asks institutions to show evidence that the graduate curriculum is engaged in review of the literature and research or some sort of practicum. And those particular outcomes can certainly be found within the DQP as they ask students to be able to demonstrate facility with research methods and be able to construct original arguments from presented evidence, etc., etc. So the DQP, I think, could be really helpful in demonstrating the graduate curriculum rigor and the necessary elements of a graduate curriculum, at least according to SACS. So as a quick summation of this slide, I think the DQP, if implemented, could be extraordinarily helpful in setting up an assessment framework, an objective framework that will in turn help the construction of the 6 SACS narratives that I'm showing here, as well as probably some other ones. But these 6, I think, would be the ones that are most helped by DQP implementation. As an example of a specific professional program re-accreditation standard, I use the CCNA Standards for nursing, and the reason I picked those was because of the nursing presence in many institutions, both health science related, like the institution I'm at, but also in more traditional academic institutions. It's not uncommon for academic institutions to have a nursing program, and those nursing programs are responsible to CCNA standards. So that's why I picked this as an example. We could have picked respiratory therapy standards or physician assistant standards or anything like that. But I figured the nursing ones would be the most common and useful to everyone. It's important to note that these standards are only for baccalaureate and graduate programs, so they're not applicable to associate's level nursing programs, and so that part of the DQP isn't really applicable here. Like the broader SACS standards, there are several CCNA standards that have to do with facilities or credentialing of faculty and all that stuff, so the DQP is not going to be especially relevant for those. But it might be especially relevant for Standard 3 and Standard 4 of the CCNA standards. Standard 3 of the CCNA standards deals with program quality, particular curriculum and teaching and learning practices. 3B states that expected student outcomes in the program reflect professional nursing standards. and specifically it refers to the essentials of baccalaureate education for professional nursing practice and the essentials of master's education in nursing. I think it would be kind of interesting to dive pretty deep into those professional standards and look at how their particular outcomes for nurse preparation align with the DQP. That's not what's happening here. That's a pretty deep and specific project, so hopefully we'll get to that in the near future. So that's something that hopefully will come down the road. 3C, however, talks about the necessity of a logically structured curriculum. And the first part of CCNA Standard 3C says that the BSN curricula is built upon the foundation of arts, sciences, and humanities. So a liberal arts core, really, or a liberal arts foundation to the Bachelor's of Science in Nursing degree. For this, I think the DQP could be especially helpful, not just for the nursing program in particular, but as the nursing program would align with the general ed program in the institution or other institutions that kind of transfer their students into the BSN program. So for example, here at the Health Science Center in San Antonio, we don't have, a core curriculum. We don't do gen ed specifically here, so all our bachelor students transfer in, most of them from the community colleges around. But wouldn't it be awesome if our nursing program, had conversations with those feeder institutions and know that the feeder institutions were using the DQP specifically, and so the BSN program could then align its own foundational programs with the DQP kind of liberal arts core foundation program of arts, sciences, and humanities. That way you would know, what those students are coming in with, whether they come in with an associate degree. It could look at the DQP and say, well, the associate degree means that our students have done X, Y, and Z, and so the bachelor's degree will enable them to, take that next step up the degree qualifications profile, in addition to giving them the nursing skills that a BSN requires. So because the DQP, is an attempt to align and construct a logically structured curriculum all the way from an associate's degree all the way up through a master's degree, the DQP could certainly help a lot, right, in professional programs that have standards related to foundational or core knowledge apart from the specific professional knowledge. And using the DQP could give that structure, or could help provide some of that structure to the logically structured curriculum, outside of the pure professional knowledge that a degree like a BSN seeks to cultivate. Finally, Standard 3G in the CCNA Standards discusses evaluation of individual student performance and says that there must be sound evaluation and assessment practices for individual students. Well, if the DQP is used to provide and construct learning outcomes across 5 categories, I think that certainly would count as a sound assessment and evaluation practice, especially given the language the DQP uses for those outcomes, which really suggest not just particular outcomes, but ways of demonstrating achievement of those outcomes, that is, assignments that lead to artifacts for assessment. I also wanted to talk for a minute about Standard 4 of the CCNA Standards, which is Program Quality, Assessment, and Achievement of Program Outcomes. The program effectiveness or program outcomes discussed in Standard 4 are often quantitative, or a lot of them are quantitative. It talks about employment rates after graduation, talks about program completion rates, licensure and certification pass rates. So these are program outcomes, that nursing programs have to demonstrate, that they have to set targets and show that they're meeting these targets for these outcomes under the standard. But it also talks about student learning outcomes as an example of program outcomes. Here I think the DQP could be helpful in elevating or stating student learning outcomes as a program outcome. So if your program outcome is that all Bachelor's of Science in Nursing students will be able to integrate scientifically based research into nursing practice, there are integrative learning outcomes within the DQP that can be drawn upon, to frame and properly state student learning outcomes and kind of elevate them to the level of program outcomes within a BSN program. And again, the alignment and the scaling are really helpful here. So using the DQP to frame program level student learning outcomes also allows you to show that these are outcomes that extend beyond the program. They're outcomes related to bachelor's degrees or master's degrees, even outside of nursing, and they're outcomes that kind of build in a stair-steppy way on previous degree outcomes. So, your bachelor's of science in nursing outcomes are then aligned with associate's level outcomes from a community college or another LPN program or something like that. So to quickly sum up, using the CCNA standards as an example of professional program standards and their relationship to the DQP, I think the DQP is helpful. Obviously, it's not going to give you a list of specific nursing learning outcomes, but it could be very helpful in aligning the nursing outcomes to the broader foundation, liberal arts, or general ed outcomes that the DQP represents, as well as aligning particular bachelor's or master's level outcomes to the previous step, the previous level of outcomes in the DQP. And it's also helpful for kind of elevating what may be seen as particular course level student learning outcomes to program level student learning outcomes, because the DQP is sort of a degree level outcomes or a degree level statement of outcomes. So having looked at those two sets of standards, the SAC standards and the CCNA standards, how useful is the DQP for accreditation efforts? Well, in and of itself, the Degree Qualifications Profile won't enable the SAC's compliance report to be written in half a day. It won't make things easier, dramatically easier, except for a few particular standards that relate to academic programs and assessment. But I think implementing the practice and the process of the Degree Qualifications Profile could make the practice and the process of accreditation easier, particularly for those program alignment requirements, the assessment requirements, and other sorts of things that deal directly with the academic side of accreditation efforts. One of the things the DQP gives you is consistent, scaled, and easily understood learning outcomes for associates, bachelor's, and master's level programs. So that, in and of itself could be a very big help, especially if you're at an institution that awards multiple degrees within a particular field. It also gives you a really good relationship, or really easy way to see the relationship between general education and programs or discipline-specific outcomes. So the way the DQP outcomes are framed, they are very gen ed-ish, but it doesn't take a whole lot of work to take some of them and put them within the context of a program or discipline-specific, or put them within the context of a discipline and make them discipline-specific outcomes. And then especially, if you combine it with a tuning process where your very discipline-specific outcomes are then aligned sort of across the discipline or across the institution or across institutions, then that becomes even more valuable. For professional accreditation in nursing programs or other professional or pre-professional programs, some of the tuning work is already done, right? I mean, because you have national accreditors that have set standards, in some cases highly detailed standards about what the curriculum ought to contain. So that work is done, and one of the things the DQP does is sort of helps you align those discipline-specific outcomes with general education outcomes, I think, because it gives this really nice package of gen ed outcomes. Another thing the DQP does, it gives gives programs easily demonstrable increases in rigor and emphasis in degree programs because of the stair-step nature of the degree qualifications profile. It has associate's outcomes, it has bachelor's outcomes, it has master's level outcomes. These outcomes are already aligned but differentiated, right? So the bachelor's ones are more complex and more demanding than the associate's ones. The master's ones are more complex and demanding than the bachelor's ones. So it really helps when you're trying to show that there's an increase in rigor as one increases the level of degree. Of course, any, I think, assessment plan or assessment program that discusses outcomes or revision of outcomes can help with curriculum mapping. And so I think having the DQP grid up on the wall and being committed to incorporating that or using that as a basis can really facilitate conversations about curriculum alignment, where and when to assess these particular learning outcomes, and also the values. I mean, in the CCNA standards, it talks about the BSN is built upon a foundation of arts, sciences, and humanities. And so that's a value statement, right? Saying that those disciplines, that the broader general education disciplines are important to a particular professional degree. And so I think, bringing the DQP into those conversations can really help when discussing curriculum alignment, but also, what does our professional degree mean when we award students a bachelor's of science in nursing or a bachelor's of science in dental hygiene or something like that. Well, this concludes my presentation about the Degree Qualifications Profile and Accreditation. I hope it was useful and helpful to you, or at least made you think or curious about the DQP. This is part of my Leap Texas Fellow project, and I welcome comments and questions or suggestions for this and other projects related to the DQP. You can reach me at the email there on the slide, popen@utesca.edu, or via Twitter at Prof Pope. And be sure to check out the Leap Texas website, leaptx.org, where this resource and a whole bunch of other resources on the Liberal Education and America's Promise project in Texas can be found. Thank you very much.